All right, so let's begin. Welcome to our fourth panel. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Harry Surden. I'm a professor on the faculty here at the University of Colorado Law School. I teach primarily intellectual property and computers in the law and write about some privacy areas. And I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion panel. So far we have discussed privacy harms, tracking by businesses, tracking by government surveillance. In this panel, we're going to shift our focus more towards addressing, managing, reducing, or preventing those harms. And we'll be more focused on the issue of commercial privacy harms than government in this panel. So assuming for a moment that there are privacy harms, what do we do about them? Do we rely upon industry self-regulation, industry groups to generate best practices? Do we rely on individual businesses to have privacy compliance units or privacy policy units? Do we rely upon market discipline? If a company is generating too many privacy harms, relying on customers to leave and the economic incentives to work themselves out? Do we rely on new methods of increased transparency for consumers or increased consumer control? Government regulation, new privacy regulation, increased agency oversight, technological design. Do we build privacy directly into the architecture of the technologies we use? Or, more likely, some combination of all of these. So joining me in discussing this topic is a very distinguished panel. So in the interest of time, let me only briefly introduce them, but our distinguished panelists have very extensive biographies in the program. So starting to my left, we have Woody Hartzog, who is a professor at the Cumberland School of Law at Samford University. Next, we have Alvaro Bedoya, who is chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and Law, and works with Senator Franken. Next, we have Paula Bruning, who is senior counsel for global privacy policy at Intel. Next, we have Michael Hinsey, who's chief privacy counsel at Microsoft Corporation. And last but not least, Rob Sherman, who is the manager of privacy policy at Facebook. So we've got a great panel with us, I think, representing a diversity of views. And let's start this off with a presentation by Woody about a recent paper he wrote, and then we'll return to the panel for some reaction.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Harry. Thank you, Amy, everyone at Silicon Flatirons, Paul, for putting together such an excellent conference. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm honored to speak with you about, well, what do we do with this mess of our inability to articulate privacy harms? And so we are tasked with tailoring solutions. Well, I want to start off with something that may seem relatively obvious, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same starting page here, and that's that it's easier to craft privacy solutions when the harm is obvious. Now, that may not need stating, but I think that it's worth starting off as a baseline point, which is when the harm is peeping, for example, it's relatively easy to just outright, forbid peeping. When the harm is fraud, ID theft, well, we just kind of ban that outright. I won't say ID theft. Is Julia still in the room? But I'll say fraud. I do think she's right about that, actually. But the point that I want to talk about today is when it gets hard to tailor privacy solutions. And that's when harms are indirect, opaque, or cumulative. And so what do I mean by that? Well, it's harder to craft solutions when you don't really know what's wrong. And that's kind of what we're getting at here. So surveillance is a kind of activity that can produce a cumulative harm, or one that's, we know that if you're standing on the public street and you have a picture taken of you, well, maybe it's no big deal. But if someone engages in continuous surveillance over a long period of time, well, then we feel like maybe perhaps some kind of harm has occurred here. We don't know exactly when to draw that line, and that's why it's difficult to fashion remedies. And one of the areas that I really want to focus on is socially shared information. And the reason why is that socially shared information is particularly problematic because it's not private in the traditional sense of the word. And because it's not private, it's not exactly clear what the harms are from other people seeing stuff that you share to 100 or 1,000 people. And I speak a lot about things like social media and privacy, and I get a lot of response back where people say, how could you possibly consider what things that are posted on Facebook could be private because they're shared with 1,000 people? I think they are. We can have a conversation about that. But I want to move past that, and I want to talk about what we do about that. So if we do get a sense that maybe there's some kind of harm with respect to the use of socially shared information, what do we do about it? Well, perhaps because it's so hard to get a handle on these things, privacy policymakers have responded with what I will call comparatively modest remedies. These remedies are modest, and when I say modest, what I mean is they're modest in the sense that they don't go all the way by taking every available step in restricting some kind of activity or protecting privacy. Instead, they're measured or tactical. Now, the value of modest remedies has been questioned. So privacy advocates often say that modest remedies are no good because they don't go far enough, right? So you cover some of the information, but you leave this massive amount open. Great example is California's recent online eraser law, as it has been dubbed, which basically pushed the hand of people that host user-generated content. So you have to design your website in such a way that teens can delete the information that they posted. Well, they didn't say anything about being able to delete information that other people posted. And some privacy advocates said, wait a second, this doesn't even go far enough. You should be able to delete everything. Businesses and others argue that remedies that are modest in nature are not worth the cost to innovation, speech, and other sometimes competing values because they don't truly solve the privacy problem. So if you don't completely solve the privacy problem, then perhaps you shouldn't even have this thing in the first place because it doesn't justify the cost to things like innovation. My thesis is that modest privacy protections have been undervalued in a hyper-social world. I think that criticisms of these protections are often based on a misperception that it is futile or unnecessary to protect information that's shared with other people. To that end, and more to a more specific thesis, I argue that modest privacy protections like notice and design might be the best way to protect privacy in semi-private information or in any other context where harm is indirect or opaque or cumulative or otherwise difficult to get a handle on. I argue that the cumulative effects of modest protections can actually be quite robust. So, this makes solutions that are centered around design and notice really optimal. Now, what do I mean by modest privacy protections? In a sense, all U.S. law is modest because it's sectoral, right? So we don't have one federal omnibus privacy law in the United States. And so to the extent that people have supported the sectoral approach to the United States approach to privacy, I would second that. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about remedies that are sometimes criticized because they don't cover the full range of bad actors or problematic practices. They only, say, indirectly prohibit problematic action. So, for example, there are really two kinds. One kind is porous coverage. Privacy protections sometimes don't cover the full range of problematic activities. So the online eraser law is one example because it only protected self-disclosed information. Another example is state laws that prohibit employers from asking for access to job applicants' social media profiles. And you've probably read a lot about this, where we've had a lot of state laws popping up. Now, what does this do? A lot of criticism comes because of these laws, because people say, well, they could probably find out in other ways information that's on someone's social media profile. So does this law really prohibit that? I mean, there's lots of information that's on your profile, and you could really just go backdoor it and ask someone else to access it. And so, it doesn't really cover things. And so these are examples of porous coverage for laws that apply to socially shared information. And in the paper that I write, and I don't have a lot of time to get into it now, is that temporal modesty also holds great promise. So maybe we only protect things for a short amount of time. Sometimes the we need protection when it's first disclosed, and sometimes the only time we really need protection is long after it's been disclosed and we don't want someone digging it up. The other kind of modest protection that we're talking about are indirect or weak remedies. So these are remedies that do not directly prohibit problematic conduct. Rather, they indirectly obligate or prohibit certain activities as a means to reduce the likelihood of problematic activity occurring. If you think about it, this is precisely what data security is, right? So when you obligate someone to have good data security, you're indirectly regulating against a certain kind of privacy harm, which is largely unauthorized takings of information and hacking. The employer access statutes can be seen this way as well. Notice is another example where you're kind of indirectly regulating a certain kind of harm, where they say, listen, some kind of people can see your information, so maybe you should, watch out. So in the attempt to keep this brief, I will say why value modesty? Well, I think there are several reasons why. One is I think it fills a gap. I think that it can bridge between providing a small amount of robust protection for a small amount of information, and then basically having this chasm where not many things are protected. Diverse concepts like privacy need diverse protections, and we need to start a conversation about how to create privacy remedies that don't go all the way but can apply much more broadly, because there are very few activities that we do online that don't implicate some kind of privacy concern. And to leave them completely unguarded, I think, is folly. It will help us balance with competing values. So Paul Ohm had an excellent article where he called Pretty Good Privacy, where he argued that transparency and privacy goals could both be met by making information hard but possible to obtain. And that's kind of one way that we can balance things like free speech, security, transparency. And finally, I think that modest protections are politically palatable. They help us make sure that perfect isn't the enemy of good when we're trying to accomplish things. And in conclusion, just in the interest of time, I'll say that modest approaches like design and notice-based remedies have great utility, and I don't think that we should be so quick to criticize them when they don't get it all. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Well, thank you, Woody, for that very interesting presentation. So it sounds like you're saying some critics are decrying privacy protections that are modest in the sense that they do not comprehensively deal with the privacy issue, but rather address in some piecemeal, limited, or incremental manner. Turning it over to the panel, and let me throw this out to Rob first. Do you agree with the the examples that Woody gave as, would you characterize them as modest? And do we agree with this assessment that some limited protection for privacy is better than nothing?
So I think it's really interesting the way that, Woody, that you analyze the privacy regime in the United States and thinking about what's modest and what's not. Because I think there's an important concept that's sort of implicit in the whole analysis, which is that context matters, right? So it used to be that privacy was, I'll simplify a little bit and just say, I think it used to be that privacy was easier, right? It was very binary. It was, I go to my bank account and I don't want the bank to say what's in my account. Now people are much more sophisticated about their information. I think we have a question about, how do we educate people and what are people's preferences? But people generally are thinking more about their privacy and more about their information. People are on Facebook and they want to share. That's why people go on Facebook. But I also think it's the case, and you make this point in your paper too, that privacy is not binary, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, the fact that people are on Facebook and want to share, that I think doesn't mean they want their information to be private in the sense of being secret, but I think it would be a big mistake to say that obviously that means that they want it to be public. I think people want to be in control of their information, and different contexts and different pieces of information work in different ways. So I think maybe this is a definitional issue, Woody. I disagree with sort of because the context matters and because people have different views, I disagree with the characterization of a lot of the laws that we have in the US that cover privacy as modest. I think they're modest in the sense that they aren't a single piece of legislation that establishes privacy rights for everyone across all domains. But I think what we've done instead is we've said, okay, here are some areas where we see concrete harms. So we take, you talk about, the financial sector, the health sector, where we see there are concrete harms that can come from misuse of this information. And so we want to set ground rules there that are hard and fast and everybody looks at them. But we've not said those same rules should apply across domains. And I think characterize, and again, maybe we get to the same place, but characterizing those as modest means, it means that we're sort of saying, is limited protection good enough? And I actually think the virtue of what you're calling modest privacy protections, but really sort of a sectoral approach that relies on not just legislation, but regulatory enforcement, litigation, self-regulation, and business incentives, is actually that we're having a much more flexible regime that actually is giving people better protection because it allows them to be empowered to make the choices that they want. And I think that the things that you talked about around notice and other mechanisms for empowering people are really important. But so I think, again, I think maybe we get to the same place. But it's not the case that these things are modest and therefore we need to address them and figure out how to fix them.
Other reactions?
Yeah, I actually more or less agree with your characterization of some of these as modest in the sense that they are not absolute and foolproof to address all possible harms in a given scenario. But I think that's okay. I think I agree with you that these provide real meaningful protections in these contexts where it's hard to define harms and all that. So I like what you've done with this paper for the most part. It's always struck me that there's been almost a cottage industry in the privacy field for a number of years of criticizing the different approaches to protecting privacy. There's been a lot of literature on criticizing notice and the consent regime. There's been literature including the seminal article that Paul wrote on anonymization and pointing out the shortcomings of that. And so all of these measures that companies have adopted over time can be characterized as modest in the sense that they are not absolute, foolproof protections of privacy. But I think it's a mistake to conclude that they're useless. It's a mistake to conclude that you should throw them out. I think of these as risk mitigation strategies, as is often the case in regulated areas, in any area of regulation. And I look at some of the literature and I look at things that have been pointed out as privacy failures. And one that comes to mind as I was reading your paper is the example from almost a decade ago now of AOL releasing a bunch of search data. It's been talked about over and over and over again. And what happened, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, is AOL released the records of about 650,000 users of their service, and there was the search records, and they, quote unquote, anonymized it by stripping out IP addresses, but replacing it with a unique identifier per user so you could tell that the same user did different search terms over and over again. They released this publicly so that researchers could look at it and do interesting things with it. Well, lo and behold, some people looked at it and were able to re-identify a couple of people, and there was one that was really well publicized. And that was a problem. The method they used for anonymization was not perfect. But to look at it through another lens, this was, depending on how you count, there was maybe one or two people who were identified. There were a couple others who came forward themselves and said, I was that person. So let's say generously 5 people were re-identified. Out of 650,000, that's a 99.999 success rate. And what other regulatory fields looks at a 99.999 success rate and calls it a failure? I'm not aware of any. And I'm not justifying that instance or saying it wasn't a problem. If, in fact, they had layered on another modest privacy protection of releasing it in limited numbers to vetted researchers under an NDA, that probably would have gone from 99.999 to 100%. But that's 2 modest privacy protections that you're applying to that data set to address risk. The one thing that struck me as I was reading your article, though, that I think I disagree with is the conclusion that the current approach to privacy law in this piecemeal way is a good thing. I think the modesty of it can be helpful to think about it in that way, but the piecemeal approach, I think, can be problematic as well. In that, you've got, somebody said in the last panel, California sort of setting the standards in many cases, but even within that one jurisdiction, it's piecemeal. And when you layer on that with federal and state and all of the rest, it can be a really complicated set of laws to navigate and figure out what you're going to do with. And Microsoft has supported the idea of a comprehensive federal baseline privacy law for years and years and years. And it's a very hard thing to do, and we may hear some more about that later in the panel. But it would just be so much simpler to have a single standard, which then self-regulation and company practices could build on top of, but at least a single baseline standard across the country, from our perspective, would be a very attractive thing.
Other reactions?
I think, in thinking about, Woody's paper in the context of what's gone on here today, I really think instead of thinking about them as modest, and maybe I'm keying a little bit off of Mike, is thinking more of as tools in a toolbox that you can use to protect privacy. And from a company's standpoint, I sort of, Chris Wolf's comments earlier sort of brought to mind that, privacy isn't just compliance anymore, that you can follow all the rules, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, follow every law to the letter and still not end up with good privacy, because we are in this environment that's so dynamic, where the harms are so opaque and they're not well formed, and we're still trying to figure them out and what they mean in this current environment. And so I think some of the work that's been done in the last few years about accountability, and I know some people in this room will go, she's talking about it again, oh God, because I've talked about it a lot, but I think what accountability does is says, you've got these tools and you've got to mitigate risk, and you've got to use a lot of different tools. It's not just about whether or not you're complying with the law. And it's not about risk to the company, it's about risk to the individual. So how do all those different tools in the toolbox, how can you bring them to bear in your company in a way that allows you to use data in innovative ways, but still assess the risk to the individual and then mitigate that risk? I think the harder question right now is, and it goes back to the conversation we've been having about harm and risk, is, as this environment's evolving at increasingly rapid rates, how do you talk about harm, and is that really a question that can be solely taken on by a business who has certain motivations? Does that really work, and is this really part of a larger conversation that needs to be happening in the public forum about where we want to go as a society and what our values are?
Yeah, I had two reactions. And first of all, let me say everything I say is my own position, does not reflect that of my boss or the subcommittee on privacy. So two reactions. The first is I want to wholeheartedly agree that modest interventions can have value. And the clearest example for me is a letter that Senator Franken wrote to Euclid, which is an in-store tracking company that many of you are familiar with. And Euclid was tracking folks in stores, across different stores, and in front of stores using their MAC addresses, which are unique and generally cannot be changed except without great effort. And Senator Franken wrote them a letter, and this is all done on an opt-out basis without any notice at the front of the store. Senator Franken wrote him a letter, said, hey, maybe you should do this on an opt-in basis, maybe you should let people know you're doing this. And Euclid said, no, we're not going to do this opt-in, but we will give folks notice. And sure enough, one person saw the notice at the front of a store, Nordstrom's, and soon thereafter, Nordstrom's got rid of all this technology. And I'm not saying Senator Franken wanted them to get rid of the technology, but it did have an impact. Are modest interventions ideal? No. Are they perfect? No. But they do have a very clear impact. The other thing I wanted to push back on is your discussion about public and shared information. Because for me, it's very, very clear that just because information is public or is shared, that the harms from the use or misuse of that data are not necessarily opaque, indirect, or hard to get a handle on. In other words, just because it's public, just because it's shared, doesn't mean there is going to be little privacy harm from the use or misuse of that data. And facial recognition is the best example of this. Now, to be candid, there's nothing really as public as your face, right? But to be candid, we are, in Ryan Kalow's dichotomy, definitely in the pre-objective state of privacy harms for facial recognition, for the simple fact that the technology isn't deployed so pervasively that we're encountering it every day on the street. But factually and legally, we are not very far from the world where we're seeing real, objective, ancient, in your dichotomy, Paul, privacy harms as a result of the use of this technology. And I'll give 3 examples. The first is the FBI's use of facial recognition technology in its next generation identification program. This is a nationwide federal facial recognition program that is coming to a state near you probably by this year. The rules around this program are very broad, require it to be used exclusively for criminal justice purposes. But guess what? In most of the states where it was deployed just a year ago, it was a crime to do things like block a sidewalk or obstruct traffic. And in fact, we did some research and we found examples of the FBI in internal FBI presentations showing how this technology could be used to identify protesters in a crowd. One example. Second example with respect to Rob, we've had many conversations about this, is Facebook's use of facial recognition technology. And Facebook, in our minds, has built the world's largest privately held database of face prints. And this was done on an opt-out basis. And so if you're in this room and you're part of Facebook and you haven't opted out of this technology, you likely have a face print in Facebook's databases. Facebook has, as is its right, resisted efforts to make forward-facing promises as to how it will or will not treat that data. The third example is the street-level use of facial recognition technology. And we are just now seeing what Alessandro Acquisti, what Ashkan Soltani, what a whole lot of folks have said would come soon, which is the street-level use of this data. And I think it was a month ago when the first beta app for jailbroken Google Glass devices was released that would allow facial recognition of strangers on the street. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to think, gee, what could possibly go wrong if I can go walk in the street and identify by name the stranger that I think is super interesting in the corner. So I would love to know, to press you on that side of it. But overall, modest interventions, very good. I'll leave it at that.
Brief reactions from Woody or Rob to those?
Well, I'll jump in and say I actually completely agree with you on the second point, and I didn't mean to, if I did imply that public information cannot lead to direct harms or is in no way harmful. As a matter of fact, I'll take it a step further, and I'll say that I think that the term public information is as poorly theorized as the term privacy, and that we throw it around a lot as a talisman, but I don't think it means, when push comes to shove, what the law has traditionally taken it to mean, because it was formed in a time where, in all likelihood, even if you were standing in public, there was very little chance that you would be surveilled, so we called it public and we were okay with that. I think that's changed dramatically. And so maybe to Rob's point earlier is that, or a few other people's points earlier, is that I think that the best way to think about remedying privacy harms is the way that we view privacy generally, which is probabilistic, right? Every time we walk outside in anything that we do, we run a calculus where we say, someone's probably not going to identify me, so I'm okay with being outside. Someone's probably not going to find this information, so I'm okay with posting it on Facebook, people that I don't want to see it. And so we run that calculus, and I think that facial recognition technologies actually threaten a lot of what we see as this calculus that we run of probabilistic harm. We're like, now it's significantly more probable maybe that you'll be identified.
Sure. So I want to respond first to something that Paula said that I thought was really interesting, which was you referred to the various remedies that we have for privacy as a toolkit. I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about it. And the thing I would add to it is that I think the different pieces of the toolkit and what we've seen in this country is that they layer on top of one another and work really well together. Commissioner Brill, for example, talked about some of the FTC's enforcement efforts, which have been very public. I think those have driven changes in the marketplace. I think they've driven awareness on the part of people. I think there's been interest on the Hill that's played into that as well. And I think that as a consequence, the sort of collective shift is that people are more thoughtful about privacy, people meaning companies, people meaning regulators, people meaning consumers, everybody. And so I think, the technology, facial recognition is actually a good example of this, where the technology isn't there yet. And, and there's a lot of things that people are worried that might happen but aren't happening yet. And I think by layering all of those different tools in the toolkit on top of one another, we're actually getting to a really good place. So I feel good about that. Just very briefly, this isn't a panel about facial recognition, but I should respond since my company was mentioned. I mean, I think it's another example, and the first thing I'll say is, you talked about Facebook, but obviously there are, all of the major tech companies have similar products, and so, I take your comment as us being an example rather than sort of the only company in this category. But the broader point that I'd make, and this goes to the toolkit idea, is, technology like facial recognition, I think, can be used, in lots of ways that can be used in privacy-preserving ways, or in privacy-diminishing ways. So, for example, on Facebook, people upload photos of you all the time. They can do that on lots of photo sharing sites across the web. The purpose of the facial recognition technology that we use is to make it easier for people to tag you in photos, which lets you know that that a photo of you has been posted, which you otherwise wouldn't have any way of knowing. And then you can then take action. You can untag yourself from the photo. You can ask the person to delete it. You can report it to Facebook and take action on it. And this is actually a big innovation because that just didn't exist before. There was really no, there were lots of photos. Lots of other companies had photo databases, and there's just really no opportunity to take action. And that goes back to the point that Woody made earlier. So I think I actually see our use of facial recognition technology in the way that we've implemented it as something that actually creates real value for people from a privacy standpoint.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit, but continue with the theme of government regulation. And I'll throw this out to Alvaro. From your perspective with Senator Franken and in the Senate, what are some of the biggest current privacy harms that you're concerned about, and what do you think are some of the most effective legislative or government interventions?
Sure. So before I dig into that, let me just say that what Senator Franken always says, and I fully agree with him, is that he sees privacy as a fundamental right. And part of privacy being a fundamental right is that you shouldn't have to lose money or bleed in order to protect it. And so, I think he is perfectly comfortable doing oversight, legislating in areas where harms are more subjective than objective. But with that said, I wholeheartedly agree with Paul that there are some real bad harms out there, and that folks in D.C. very much pay attention when you can highlight them. And so I'll just highlight two. The first is GPS stalking, and it relates to Senator Franken's introduction of a location privacy bill, which will soon be reintroduced. And the second are democratic harms that I think triggered his interest in transparency around the NSA surveillance activities. So the first, GPS stalking. And Julie, I'm really glad, raised this on an earlier panel. GPS stalking is not a small thing. If you were to go on Google right now and put in something like track my girlfriend, which I'm not suggesting you do, it would not be very hard for you to find an app that you could download on someone else's phone that would let you track that person 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The latest statistics are from 2006, and they suggest that tens of thousands of women are tracked annually through the use of GPS devices. Anecdotally, many domestic violence shelters, the first thing they do when you come in is either take the battery out of your cell phone or put your cell phone in a fridge, in a freezer. Or just say you can't bring that in here. The freezer trick is something different. And we got some harrowing testimony from domestic violence groups in Minnesota about, for example, a woman going to a shelter at a courthouse, at a county building, and getting a text from her husband saying, "Hey, why are you in the county building?" And then immediately going to get a restraining order at the courthouse and getting another text from her husband saying, "Hey, why are you at the courthouse? Are you getting a restraining order against me?" And so this is real. And a natural question is, hey, your location privacy bill is not restricted to stalking apps. And the answer, there's many answers to that question as to why we have a broad location privacy bill. But part of it comes from an anecdote. One day, Senator Franken was at a markup, an executive committee hearing where you actually amend legislation in the lead up to the vote on his bill. And he trotted out an app, one of these stalking apps, and he read from it, and he named it and read from it. And he said, I believe that the tagline, the headline was, "Worried that your spouse is cheating? Track their every move through the use of our neat cell phone spy software." And so he read it and did it by name. And so out of curiosity, I had a hunch that someone would say, "Hey guys, do you know that folks are talking about you this way?" And sure enough, 2 days later, we log on, and instead of, "Hey, are you worried your spouse is cheating?" it said, "Are you worried about what your kid does after school?" And so not every stalking app advertises itself as such, and I'm not suggesting that family locator apps are actually stalking apps, but you need to cast a broad net to capture a lot of bad behavior. The second point, I don't want to take too much time, democratic harms. Senator Franken's interest in NSA has focused on what he perceives as the democratic harms that come about from a lack of transparency around the NSA surveillance programs. And I don't mean chilling effects. I literally mean democracy does not work when the people do not have even a rough sense of what their government is doing. And what is remarkable to him and what's remarkable to me is that 7 months after the Snowden leaks, the American government has yet to tell the American people even roughly how many of them have had their information collected through these programs and how many of them have had their information actually reviewed. So the final point I'll say on this is Senator Franken introduced a bill that does two things. It says companies, you can say the number of orders you got and roughly how many customers were affected. Government, you have to say number of people, number of those people who are American, and a couple other things. And the response from NSA was not, no, we don't want to do that. It was, no, we cannot do that. It is difficult, if not impossible, to estimate the number of individuals whose information we collect and the number who are probably American. This is from an entity that hires more mathematicians than NASA, than Caltech, than MIT, than Harvard. And what we've done is gone through and surveyed statisticians at the nation's leading universities, and the response is either, I don't know too much about this, or, oh, yeah, you can do that. And so that is what's motivating right now for those pieces of legislation.
So let me just clarify the GPS stalking legislation. Would that be criminalization of that?
No. So, well, yes and no. There's like a good lawyer. I'm from DC, no.
And maybe.
And maybe. No. There is a narrowly tailored criminal penalty for folks who a criminal prosecutor could prove intent, are intentionally operating a system to facilitate stalking. So there is that very, very narrow penalty. But additionally, there is a general rule that says if you want to collect someone's location information, you need to get their permission. And if you want to share that location information, you need to get their permission.
And that would be civil?
Civil, yes.
Okay. All right, so let me throw this out to the panel and generalize a little bit. You've identified some of the important privacy harms, GPS stalking, and more generally, how do you feel about government interventions that involve things like prohibition of certain privacy violating behaviors, either through criminal penalties or civil penalties, or other solutions involving increased transparency or notice or permission? Can you react to those?
I mean, it's hard to react at a general level because every situation is different. But I will say at a high level, absolute prohibitions are more likely to have unintended consequences because we don't know how these technologies might be used 5-10 years from now. Clearly, things like better transparency and better disclosures are things that I think most companies would be very comfortable with. I think the GPS example that is used here, I think back to a few years ago, it wasn't a location-based issue, but when we were building parental controls into some of our features so that parents could see what websites their kids were going to. We worked with some domestic violence advocates, I guess anti-domestic violence advocates, to make sure that they pointed out to us, well, this could be used by an abusive spouse to find out they're searching for the shelter. Right. So make sure that there's an indicator on that would be obvious that it would at least trigger somebody to know that this is being monitored in some way or that somebody can get this information. So I think those kinds of things are really useful and really helpful. Prohibitions on the truly bad behavior. The prohibitions on the stalking behavior are not troubling. Prohibitions that would restrict the use of GPS technology or other particular technologies in a way that might not foresee future good uses would be more problematic.
Sure. So, I agree with the line that Mike is drawing between prohibitions against objectionable conduct whatever form it might take and whatever technology it might use, and prohibitions against the use of particular technologies. I mean, I think the best example of this is mobile, and I was going to point to my mobile phone, but I realized I left it over there to avoid. All right, we'll show the nice Windows phone here.
You could tell I'm a Microsoft employee.
That's right. That's good. I'll ask for my commission later. So, I mean, I think if we'd had this panel 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, and it said, how should we write privacy restrictions for the mobile environment? We would have all had really strong opinions about that, and I think we would have all probably been wrong in our predictions of what the mobile space would look like in 2014. I think it's just really hard. Technology moves very quickly. People are very innovative in the technology that they build, and the thing that I think we need to be careful of is demonizing technology, particularly technology that's in its infancy, in ways that codify restrictions that actually won't work very well. I mean, if we had written, you have to have a privacy policy, it has to look like this, and it has to be in this sort of font, and you have to be able to click on it, and now we have a Windows phone where you don't click at all. It just wouldn't work, and the structure would, I think, break. And so I think that's why the toolkit, I think, makes a lot of sense. There are clearly some places where legislation makes sense, and I think, stalking and that kind of thing, where people are engaging in objectionable conduct, whether or not it's using technology, clearly there's space there. But I think we need to be thoughtful and use the whole range of the toolkit as we can.
Do you want to?
Yeah, just one thought, and I don't want to give the impression that it's only appropriate to legislate for those worst cases, because in certain areas there's just no law that, or there is a vacuum, a legal vacuum created by bad 20-year-old law. So for location, there's the obvious law enforcement example, which probably most of you know, which is that you can get troves of historical location data without a warrant, right? But on the commercial side, if let me see if I have my phone. I have a Verizon iPhone. When I use that Verizon iPhone to place a phone call, my phone company learns my location, and they are unable by law under the Communications Act to give that location information to other people. But when I use that same phone to conduct business over the internet, Verizon learns my location, and they're able to essentially, under ECPA, do with that location whatever they want. Now, I'm not saying Verizon does this, but there are some areas where it just doesn't make sense that you regulate one person up here and then you don't regulate the same actor with a slightly different technology, not at all.
Woody, were you going to react?
Well, the idea of stalking and GPS location, I think, brings to light that a number of different approaches that you can take with harms. And so you can outright prohibit stalking, and then you can also have design requirements within phones, for example, to give you notice that would allow you to not only potentially avoid stalking, but also maybe less harmful, for lack of a better word, less harmful activities. So, maybe you are trying to hide your location for a number of different, maybe more not quite as bad reasons as wanting to avoid some kind of domestic violence, but rather you just don't want people knowing where you are. Or you're going to a store that's is maybe a little embarrassing. And so embarrassment is one of those things where I think that people feel strange, because this is where the word creepy comes out. And I think the general tenor, I don't know if there's anyone that's arguing that creepy is just the best word that we could possibly use. But it does help us kind of approximate what we're really talking about. And so we have words like, oh, well, that's embarrassing, or it's creepy. It certainly should not be used to base jurisprudence on, but it can help guide things like design, where we say, well, people generally want to avoid that. How do we design products that allow us to do that?
Right. Well, I think a lot of this echoes a perennial debate in law involving technology about the balance between technology-specific laws that mention particular technology and uses, and how quickly they become outdated. On the other hand, law, I think we all agree, has something to say as part of the toolkit of regulation, and how do you balance that? All right, so let's shift away from the government regulation discussion to, I think, something our panel knows a lot about, and the private sector and industry and specific company self-regulation. So can you talk about the value of individual company practices in policing privacy and more generally industry self-regulation within the following frame. Can the private sector effectively deal with the inevitable conflicts of interest between the economic concerns in monetizing private data and actually implementing effective privacy concerns? So let me throw that out to Mike first.
Sure. It's an interesting question, and as I mentioned before, we've been supportive of privacy legislation. We think that the government plays a critical role in protecting privacy across a variety of economic players, and so law and enforcement of those laws is absolutely critical. But as you pointed out, laws don't move as quickly as technology moves. Laws don't evolve as quickly as business models evolve. And so inevitably, I think there has to be a role for self-regulation. And some of the comprehensive legislative proposals that we have supported in the past have recognized a role for self-regulation to provide the specific rules of how the general principles might apply in a particular business model in a particular industry with a particular technology, which may not have been contemplated at the time the Congress members were drafting that law. So I think self-regulation is super effective. If you look at the best examples of self-regulation, though, I think you'd also have to acknowledge that they've been most effective when they've been sort of nudged along by government, whether it's the FTC holding a workshop and putting some pressure on industry to move forward and improve the self-regulatory approach or otherwise. On top of self-regulation, when you talk about individual companies, I think you can point to a lot of different approaches. I think on the last panel, I think it was Ryan who talked about, you got to look at the motivations. And for-profit companies are for-profit companies. They're accountable to shareholders. And the economic motive, at the end of the day, quite honestly, is almost always going to prevail. That doesn't mean that companies don't care about privacy. I think we've seen very much a number of examples where companies see an economic advantage to thinking carefully about privacy. For one, nobody wants to have those bad headlines on the front page of the New York Times about a major data breach. So we've seen companies invest huge amounts of money and resources and expertise into security programs. And the same is true for privacy. We particularly see that, I don't want to say particularly, we see that quite clearly in my company, in the part of our company that's focused on selling into enterprises. When you are selling to another company, when you're selling a cloud service to another company, they don't want you rifling through their documents, their attorney-client privilege documents. They may be in a regulated entity, a HIPAA-covered entity where they can't outsource unless there are certain protections in place. Education is another example with FERPA. So we have put a lot of effort into adopting strong policies to show these companies that we want to sell our products and services to that no, we're not going to use the data for purposes that you wouldn't expect or approve of. We're going to have strong privacy protections and access controls and all of that. The data is your data. We're not going to do stuff with it to monetize that data. You're paying us for the service. We're not going to try to monetize the data. It's a little harder on consumer services where it's been pointed out that consumers seem a little less willing to open up their wallets for services when the alternative is a free product that's supported through advertising and often targeted advertising. I think the jury is still out. I think we have made an effort to present ourselves and our practices to consumers as a more privacy protective example, and email is an example of that, where we've promised that we will not read the content of people's private emails for advertising purposes. And we've tried to contrast that with some of our competitors. I guess I don't need to name names. Again, the jury is still out on how effective that's going to be if consumers are really going to make decisions on those kinds of services based on these kinds of privacy concerns. If you survey them, they will say, of course, I care about my privacy. Of course, these practices make me uncomfortable. Like I said, the jury's still out on whether or not they're going to, change services in droves because of these kinds of differences.
Paula?
Sure. First of all, I think self-regulation is a really important piece of this, and Intel has supported that for many, many years, continues to do so. We're actively engaged in the multi-stakeholder process that the Department of Commerce has in place. We've supported the W3C process for its duration, but I think even those processes they're clumsy in their own way. They take longer than you think they're going to take. They're not smooth, and this technology is moving really quickly, and it's still difficult to keep up with it. And I think for that reason, Intel has long also believed in, as Microsoft, some kind of a baseline privacy legislation that has rules at a high enough level that you don't start going down rabbit holes with different kinds of technology, but that you really think about these issues in terms of the data itself. In the same way that these traditional notions of fair information practices worked for so long because it was so focused on data, and if you can do that with legislation as well, you get closer to something that can actually work. Part of that should also be things like privacy by design and the kind of risk assessment and mitigation that we talked about a few minutes ago that says, this even with this baseline law and sort of high-level principles, this is still moving faster than we can really keep up with it, and we're going to have to make some internal decisions to be smart about our consumers, smart about regulators, and try to create some kind of an environment, try to create tools and products and services that are not going to so offend the consumer that it hurts our own brand and reputation, then ultimately hurts the consumer too, because that's not good for us. I mean, you can do everything right, as I mentioned before, and if you've really offended the consumer, it doesn't really matter what rules you followed.
Rob, can you say something about Facebook and self-regulation?
Sure. So I think the first thing I'd say is you frame the question as sort of this tension between monetization and privacy. I'm not sure that that's a real distinction. It might in some cases be. I mean, Mike, obviously you're right that companies are beholden to their shareholders and need to make money and need to stay in business. It's also true that there's not a lot of evidence on what people will do behaviorally based on privacy. That said, I think you have to take the long view as a company and understand that people, in order to continue to use your products, whether they're business products or consumer products, need to have confidence in what you're doing, and that you're going to, if you're collecting data from them, that you're going to honor that commitment and that you're going to treat them and their data in a responsible way. So I think that translates really from the perspective of self-regulation into two things that I want to talk about. The first is how it works within a company, in any individual company, and then I think at the industry level as well. Within a company, I think we don't know for sure what people are going to do, and we don't know how to measure what's creepy. But we can do a lot of things, both in terms of surveying people and doing user studies and looking at how people react to different things to understand, what are people objecting to, and really try to understand that as best we can, and then make decisions where we design our products in a way that allows us to make money without compromising people's privacy. And obviously, it's a discussion on an individual case about what exactly that looks like. But the goal should be, you should be able to preserve somebody's privacy and continue to operate the business. And I think all the companies that are represented on this panel, I think, have spent a lot of time trying to think through that, as well as, obviously folks that aren't here. Ryan talked about an IRB type of concept on the earlier panel for privacy within companies. We have one. I know that Intel and Microsoft both have something similar. It's not called an IRB, but it's a process within the company to make privacy decisions. And rather than just sort of being subjective and saying, that sounds good, that doesn't sound good, actually try to make a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of privacy across the enterprise. And so I think we're seeing more of that. I think that it's becoming more important, not necessarily that consumers are going to say, hey, it's great that Facebook has a privacy program, but if we're doing our jobs well, at the end of the day, the products that we put out and the decisions that we make are better for it. The other thing that's maybe less intuitive at the industry level is that I think, and that I wouldn't necessarily have expected, is I think companies see value in self-regulation, even if there's not a stick pushing them along, because particularly if we see this with advertisers and other companies that we do business with. I think there's value in having an agreed upon sense of what's the right way to proceed in this area. So we see that in the area of behavioral advertising and other places where, and those are ongoing discussions as Paul has said. But I think people see that there's value in having an agreed upon understanding of what the right way is to go forward, and that helps everybody in the industry. It helps us make sure that we're doing the right thing and benchmark against each other to be sure that we're being responsible and handling people's information well. So I think we're seeing that. I mean, obviously, legislation plays a part of it as well. Regulation plays a part of it as well. But I think there's an inherent value in self-regulation and in people being on the same page that we're seeing.
Any more skeptical views of self-regulation?
You won't get it from me.
Okay.
I mean, self-regulation's great. I mean, but you need it upon a framework of laws.
Okay.
And there are large swaths of life that benefit from little to no protection from privacy law, or any privacy law that folks would deem of any value. In facial recognition. In a commercial setting, it's totally legal to go and create face prints of everyone in this room, and then use them to identify them for the rest of the conference. People might think that's great. People might think, no. I left this name tag off for a reason. I kind of want to do my thing and just listen. Similarly, for government use of facial recognition, there really is no, the telephone booth door is open, to make the cat's reference. It's not protected. Similarly with location, same thing. And there's lots of other areas where there's just no protection. Unless you've made a certain kind of promise, and unless you've really gone beyond the pale in terms of what you've done.
So I agree that self-regulation is an important component, and I agree with a lot that's been said, but I will say that I worry about just leaving it all up to self-regulation when the harm, and to bring it back to privacy harm, the harms that can happen from the collection of information is pretty remote from the person who it harms. So when information is collected, data brokers is one thing that I think about, and it's one issue that it's a black box, and we don't know how much information is going into it. So the incentive for abuse is so high that I don't know if self-regulation can overcome it, right? That it's so easy because the consumer knows nothing about what's going on, or virtually nothing, yet decisions are being made about them with data brokers. And so
So there's not the market discipline threat that maybe a Facebook.
Precisely.
Right.
Precisely. And so I think that to target some of those areas, the other example is actually data security, where it's very difficult to plot an actual harm, like what we recognize currently in the law as kind of an actual harm for data security, from a data breach. So, we get a lot of these notices, and data breach notification is certainly a very important part of this because it helps inform the consumer and remedy information asymmetries. But it's difficult to know beforehand whether anyone has good security, other than promises that are made in privacy policies that maybe not many people read. But I think that, and maybe there's a place there for some kind of co-regulation. I think that the FTC does that to a very large degree with respect to data security, where if you look at the complaints that they filed, it's very differential to industry standards. I mean, to very basic textbook 101, here's what you learn with data security. You didn't do that, and so you're not in line with basically everyone else. And so there's a lot of deference to industry there, and so maybe it can be, that's sort of a form of co-regulation where there's, the FTC is coming in and enforcing these rules, but in order to form these rules, they're actually looking to industry to form them.
Well, I was just to say, I would agree with that if I wasn't clear. I think that it is a co-regulation model. When I think of self-regulation now, I think we've sort of moved from self-regulation as industry oversight to what is really a co-regulation model.
Right.
So.
And something, I found your market discipline argument interesting, and something that strikes me is here we have large companies that have large constituents, but the same market discipline forces might not apply to smaller companies or companies who are trying to gain market share, maybe even Facebook many years ago, or the GPS stalking company, which is maybe a small company trying to gain a larger share. All right, so let's turn to our last topic here before we open it up to Q&A. So far we've talked about government regulation, business self-regulation, and one topic we haven't really talked about is privacy by design, and that's the idea that we're deliberately designing various technologies or processes consciously implementing privacy-laden decisions. So privacy protections are built in the very functionality of a technology, limiting or controlling what can be done with the data at the outset. So how does the panel feel about privacy by design as part of the tool set of privacy tools?
I'll start. So I think privacy by design is really critical. I think all of the tools in the tool set that your concept is really getting a lot of work today.
I can see
Paula.
that.
All of the tools in the toolkit that we've talked about come into play when something's gone wrong. I mean, self-regulation in some senses is proactive. Legislation can be proactive. But ideally, you avoid making those mistakes in the first instance. And I talked earlier about our internal privacy process, and I think a lot of companies have them, where we try to look at things that we're building and make a decision about how we're building it to avoid privacy problems, reduce the risk that something bad is going to happen. And I think that's really critical. We think about that both from a process standpoint and from an engineering standpoint. So at Facebook, when you post a photo on your timeline, our systems are engineered so instead of just keeping that photo in one place, there are other attributes that go along with it. So every piece of content on Facebook has an owner who posted it, the content itself, and then an audience. So any system in Facebook that's using that information has the ability to look and see, okay, that information is owned by this person and is only supposed to be seen by his friends. And it's a little thing, but it travels throughout our infrastructure and really is a way that we design our systems with privacy in mind, so that when people make a choice about who should see their information, that is taken into account and goes across the organization. And again, I think that's one example. Lots of companies have lots of examples like that, but I think to be successful with privacy, you have to start there.
Any other brief reactions? Because we want to leave some time for the Q&A.
Sure. Similar to Rob, I mean, our company has embraced that idea, and starting like 10 years ago, we developed a set of internal design standards for software and online services. We built those into the product design process rather than something that we would tack on after the fact. So very early on at the design stage, privacy experts that we have embedded within every product team have to review designs, give privacy feedback. We've got broad training so that the engineers who are designing these things have at least an awareness and a sensitivity to the privacy issues. And then throughout the process, there's different checkpoints where you have to come back in and say, have we met our standards? Are we raising unanticipated, basically, we get privacy expertise in it at different points in the process to make sure that at the end of the day, we're not, as one of the panelists on an earlier panel characterized, sort of using our customers as guinea pigs. Obviously, we don't know exactly how things will be reacted to when we release them, but we're trying to get as much expertise, internal and often external, get their eyes on things before we throw them out to the market.
Yeah, and I would just add briefly that it really is about a process. It's not just the default setting on a product at the end. And what that process allows, as Mike described it, is you can have this constant feedback loop. So when you're in this market where these expectations are changing as fast as they are, you can keep going back and saying, is this still on the right track, given where the public discussion is? Are we still going to be okay with this? Are we still not making, as Mike said, our customer guinea pig?
Well, it's interesting to hear because 10 years ago, privacy by design was kind of a lofty academic idea that sounds like it's built into the processes these days.
I think it's not quite clear exactly what privacy by design means, but I think that as a regulatory matter, design-based solutions you get a lot of mileage out of them in the sense that traditional privacy remedies, they were very strong, but they only applied in the most dramatic circumstances. Whereas when you take a design-based approach, you actually reduce the probability of harm, which I guess is what this conference is about, dramatically for everyone that uses the product. So I think that it's a way to affect a much larger chunk of people as far as a meaningful remedy goes.
All right, so let us open it up to the audience for Q&A. As always, we start with a student. So do I see a law student out there who's got a question? Okay.
Thanks. I know very little about privacy except for what I've learned today, which is kind of a lot, actually. So what I'm wondering is, in some sense, it seems like privacy harm is somehow inevitable, despite everything. There's going to be some kind of privacy harm out there. And I just keep on wondering, well, if I get harmed, then how am I made whole again? This is a piece that seems like it's missing, is like, well, what if the government does something wrong to me? Or what if a company does something wrong to me? Then? What do I get out of it? What's my compensation for it?
One thing that you see a lot in legislation nowadays is and there's the room full of privacy lawyers, so I'm sure someone will come up after me and say, no, well, actually, no. My sense is that our first digital privacy laws did not require a showing of harm to recover. You didn't have to say, you wiretapped me and, I bled, and this cost me, X, and so give me that money. Or, you intercepted you released my stored communications to people without my consent, and so I got hurt in X or Y or Z way, I lost this money. And so historically, you didn't have to show objective harm to recover. And I would say that I think that's in line with with Warren and Brandeis and the foundation of American privacy law as well. But nowadays, what you increasingly see in legislative debates is a lot of pressure from folks to say, well, you can only recover if you can show objective harm. And so nowadays, if someone learned an awful lot about you that you didn't want them to know, and you couldn't show even emotional harm, you could just say it's none of their business. In a lot of the debates and a lot of the laws being discussed, unless you can show financial harm, it will be very, very difficult for you personally to recover.
Any other thoughts? All right, let's take another question.
My curiosity is about sort of the other end of this equation. Turn the thing around and look at it from the other direction. What do you do regulatory-wise when people or corporations are deliberately deceptive about their ability to deliver privacy protections? And I'll give you one quick example: is email, ubiquitous example. I mean, you had the voluntary, honorable shuttering of Silent Circle's email program of LavaBit because they admitted what a lot of us have known for years: it's not possible to keep email that uses SMTP, POP3, and IMAP private. Technically not feasible. Yet you can go Google up any number of companies right now that are selling services guaranteeing, using those email protocols from 30 years ago, that they can protect your privacy. So to me, it's clearly a deceptive claim, but I don't see any regulatory push to make people live up to their promises.
There's a very quick answer, which is deceptive trade practices. I'm not commenting on LavaBit, but if you say X and you do not X, you can be there can be an enforcement action by the FTC.
There could be, but I've never seen anybody go after a company that's claiming to deliver privacy that actually can't.
Oh, that's the bulk. That's a mass swath of what the FTC does. Yeah, I apologize. I don't mean to be grasping.
All right, and a lot of this is also based on kind of a reasonable interpretation of what's being promised, right? So I mean, if you say something like, we promise that this email has magic dust all over it, and this magic dust will protect this email, probably less likely to be deceptive under FTC standards than if you say something like, well, I mean, you remember the identity theft protection services where someone's like, you will not get identity theft. Well, it turns out that's kind of hard to promise, right? But a lot of people believed that. And so, that's much closer. As far as your question of whether actions have been brought, the FTC at most, because they're resource constrained, can only bring, 15, 20 privacy-related claims a year. And so think about how many things are out there. So a lot of it is just the fact that not that many FTC complaints get filed.
As I recall, the CEO of one of the identity theft companies published his social security number. He was so confident, and then he had his identity theft stolen subsequently.
Yeah.
All right, so please join me in thanking our panel.